Okay, so what are we gonna film for this video comparison? I mean, beer, obviously. Yeah, but don't you think people are getting sick of that? Probably don't want to do whiskey again. Plus, that really got me last time. Could do coffee. People don't know that I'm a bigger coffee enthusiast than Peter McKinnon. Now that's a good idea. Why'd I even try? What is up, guys? Those little opening sequences are getting harder and harder to film, especially when you're filming on two different cameras and doing external audio without a recorder because you don't have a recorder. And so I'm running audio into my Ursa Mini and just recording 1080p into a black screen, and you gotta somehow sync that in post, and it's just, this video took a little bit longer to edit together. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Sigma FP and the Panasonic S1H. I've done videos over both of these cameras separately. I've actually talked quite a bit about the S1H, but I wanted to kind of compare two cameras that you might be looking to buy if you're looking to buy a full frame camera for cinema style shooting. Now, we've talked about full-blown, full-frame cinema cameras on the channel before. We talked about the Mavo LF a little bit, but I still think something like the Mavo LF, even though I did just get like a half off price reduction this week, so it's only about $7 or $8,000 to get just the body now, where when I made the first video, I believe it was like $10,000 or $11,000 to get the body. So it's really come down in price. And then Zcam is about to release a full frame cinema camera here soon. That's around $5,000 if you get the 6K version. And then of course there's the Sony and the Canons and the Red and all the other companies that have full frame cameras, but they're much more expensive. And today we want to talk about more budget friendly full frame cameras for video. So I've done some side-by-side comparisons with the Panasonic S1H and some other cinema cameras in another video. If you want to check that out, you can do so over here. But I wanted to take two cameras that might actually be in the running together to purchase. You know, over the past few months, I've actually been kind of looking for a full frame camera that I might buy to use on this channel more often and to use for some commercial gigs. So I've been trying out the full frame cameras on the market. So when I first tried out the Sigma FP, I liked the camera, I liked the image that came out of it, but like I talked about in the video, it's simply just a little box with a sensor, and there's not a ton of features on it. It doesn't have a flip out screen, it doesn't have a grip, it doesn't have a big battery on it, it doesn't have a viewfinder. So there's a lot of things about it that didn't make it really seem like the obvious camera for me to buy for doing content creation, because it just was going to be more cumbersome maybe than I wanted it to be. So that's when I switched over to testing out the Panasonic S1H, which could also shoot very high quality full frame video. By the way, when I'm talking about high quality video in this instance, I'm talking about a camera that's full frame. It can shoot 4K and at the minimum of a 10-bit color space. So that's what I've really been looking for, is a 10-bit color space. So the Panasonic S1H can do the 10-bit internally up to 400 megabits per second, and then the Panasonic S1H can do 10-bit and 12-bit RAW. It does not have a compressed codec. You have to use RAW, which is straight sequence DNG files. And so you can get a really high data rate out of the Sigma versus the Panasonic S1H. But you can see by the footage in this video, they're both very high quality cameras. So the Panasonic S1H will record an internal codec, an H.264, H.265 codec to an SD card internally on the camera, and you get two SD card slots for that camera, which is really nice. Whereas the Sigma FP, in order to get the 12-bit or 10-bit RAW out of the camera, you're going to have to record into an external hard drive. In this instance, I recorded into a Samsung T5 drive. I was actually able to borrow one of my friend's Sigma FP. He actually kitted out the camera to be more functional in a cinematic environment. and less of just a run and gun where it's just the camera itself. He actually put a cage on it, a handle on it, a monitor, a battery, and then the T5 drive is running into the back. A really nice little setup if you want to use this camera in a cinematic shooting environment. So the Cinema DNG files that are coming out of the Sigma FP are somewhere around 2000 megabits per second. So when you're recording, like I did like an 18-second clip example, because I didn't really have a fast card for the S1H, so it tends to buffer out and stop recording at around 18 to 22 seconds when I was shooting in 4K 422 10-bit. So I did that, and I did the exact same test with the Sigma FP, and I was getting 11 gig file out of the Sigma FP and only a 1.1 gig file basically out of the Panasonic. So it was kind of crazy the difference between the compression versus non-compressed codec. But oddly enough, both cameras still have a really, really nice image. And I've definitely liked the Panasonic S1H over using it the past month and haven't had any problems with the color space on it. And I think it's a really great camera, even though it's only shooting that 10-bit codec internally. So like I said before, the S1H is going to have a viewfinder on it. It's a really nice viewfinder. It's going to have a flip out screen that can articulate basically any direction that you need it to. It has a lot of dials and controls on it. So it's a better camera for just picking up a camera, grab and go, run and gun kind of shooting, versus the Sigma FP really lends itself better to an environment where it is completely kitted out like I have it in this comparison. That to be said, the Sigma FP has a really small body, so if you wanted to use it in a very small fashion, you probably could. You probably just want to get the right lenses for it and just have lots of batteries on you, and then maybe you want to record to an SD card if you're going to use that, but then it's going to be recording only at 8-bit and not a 10-bit or 12-bit codec because it cannot do that internally to an SD card unless you're shooting in 1080p. In that case, it can actually record Cinema DNG RAW to the SD card, which is actually kind of nice. Now, both the cameras do slow motion. They both do 60 frames a second, and actually the Panasonic does 120 frames per second, but you're going to have some drawbacks for doing that. On the Panasonic, you're going to lose the 422 color space, and it's going to go down to a 420 8-bit color space, I want to believe. And then actually on the Sigma FP, it could do 120 frames per second as well, but it's also going to be an 8-bit 1080 file versus the 4K 10-bit files that you could get, or the 12-bit files you could get with the RAW on the Sigma FP. And on the Panasonic, you are going to crop into the image to Super 35 when you use anything higher than 30 frames per second. We're talking about buying full frame cameras here, but there's going to be a crop when you're shooting at 60 frames per second, which is quite a bummer, but that's really the limitations of shooting on a mirrorless camera versus shooting on a full-blown cinema camera. Now, they both have many different color profiles on them, and they both actually have a log profile. I know that Sigma says that they don't have a log profile out yet for the camera, but it is coming. And also, once you throw the Cinema DNG files into DaVinci Resolve or something like that, basically you can just go in there and you can change the clip color space to a Blackmagic design color space, and that will put it in the Blackmagic log profile for you. So you actually can grade a log file on this camera. You just have to do it in post, and you cannot watch what that looks like in the camera itself. Actually, something to note about the Sigma FP is if you're going to record Cinema DNGs, you can't actually play back your files from the camera because it won't play back the Cinema DNG files for you. So that's kind of a bummer. If you're out on location and you're shooting with that camera and you record something and you want to play back a clip to make sure that it looks right, or if you want to play it back for the client, you're not able to do so unless you're shooting in the 8-bit .mov codec. So keep that in mind. So all that to be said, there are definitely more caveats, it sounds like, with the Sigma FP, but it is $1,900 versus the Panasonic S1H, which is a $4,000 camera. So although you're going to get a much higher data rate and picture quality out of the Sigma FP, you are going to have some shortcomings in some other areas on the camera, whereas on the Panasonic S1H, you're going to have a more bona fide camera, but you're going to have to kind of cut back on some of the specs of the video quality itself. Now, to some, that might be okay. To me, actually, when I was editing these files, it was actually annoying how big the files of the Sigma FP were compared to the Panasonic S1H. I can record a lot longer on a card with the Panasonic S1H, and my computer has zero problems processing the codec. Whereas with the Sigma FP, you are just eating up hard drive space very, very quickly. And some computers don't really like Cinema DNG files, so you'll find that that might be a little bit more cumbersome for your computer. I have a really fast MacBook Pro, and I didn't have any problems when I was editing with it, but I could see that some other people might have that problem. So like I always do on this channel, I like to do a less scientific approach to comparing these cameras. I want to use the cameras in a more practical scenario, in a real shooting scenario, when I have full control of the camera like I would in any other shooting environment when I'm doing something like a commercial or a short film. And less like the run and gun, run outside and just film something. I want to show what this can look like if you actually know what you're doing and you can control your light. And so to do that, I made up a little opening scene where I'm talking to myself about the YouTube channel here. So what happened was I actually filmed myself brewing a Kalita wave, but then Peter McKinnon and Daniel Schiffer released a video doing an epic B-roll sequence of Peter brewing a Kalita wave, brewing some coffee, and so I just kind of was like, well, I don't want to release my footage now. It's gonna look like I was copying them. But then I thought, well, maybe it'd be funny if I did actually try to copy them a little bit. And so that's why the second part of that opening sequence was designed around that. That was just a little nod to everyone on Twitter that I talked about before I released this video. But in the opening scene, I shot each side of the dialogue with a different camera. So maybe you guessed the cameras right off the bat when you were watching that, but I'm just gonna go ahead and reveal those right now. Spencer number 1, basically Spencer that sits down with the beer, sitting up at the counter, that was all done with the Panasonic S1H, and then Spencer number 2, who was on the couch, was all done with the Sigma FP. Now let's go back and watch some of this footage side by side like that, and see if you can tell the difference between the two cameras in this kind of practical environment. I really don't want to do whiskey again. Plus, that really got me last time. Could do coffee. People don't know that I'm a bigger coffee enthusiast than Peter McKinnon. I mean, after balancing out the cameras and adding a little color grade to it to make it look a little bit more like a movie, I found that the cameras cut together really well, and because you're paying attention to the story, it's easy to get lost between the two cameras. I can feel just a little bit that on the Panasonic S1H, I have to push the colors just a little bit more to get as much richness out of that camera, but it's hardly noticeable. Maybe like 10 points of saturation versus the Sigma FP, which already has a little bit more color there to work with. But I think both cameras look really nice. But I'll say when shooting with these side by side and really getting to see what the cameras feel like to shoot with, the S1H was a lot easier to shoot with, mostly because of where the dynamic range is mapped on the camera. It just has a lot more dynamic range in any given scenario, whereas the Sigma FP, it seemed like I need a little bit more light to make it match properly. But once to put it in the computer and really just boosted up the image from the raw file, I had so much more bit depth and latitude there that it pulled right up with no noise at all, and I was able to match perfectly in post. Now also, I feel like the Sigma FP might have a little bit of some firmware issues with it. Something happened where once I plugged in the hard drive and I had been shooting for quite a while, it just decided to freeze up the camera, and I would have to turn off the camera and unplug the hard drive to get it go back to normal. Now I did not have that problem this time, but I actually had 2 Sigma FPs in that last video when I was doing that, and it had something to do with how the files were writing to the hard drive or something, because if I plugged that hard drive into a different Sigma FP, it would do the same thing. I would turn it on, the light would hold green or hold red, and then it would just lock itself up and I couldn't use it. Now I didn't have that problem at all this time, but I did have something happen where I would start to film, and right after I start filming, the exposure would just drop all of a sudden. It would just, like, after the first second, the exposure would dip down, and I had to bring it back up in post, and that was just kind of a weird thing that happened. I didn't notice it until I got it into the computer, because I would hit record, walk around, film myself, and come back and hit record again. And somewhere in the midst of that, the exposure just changed on the camera. So I'm hoping that with some firmware updates, this camera will get a little bit better. I still really like the image out of this camera. I think it's a good camera. And so it's definitely still something worth looking into, even though I've seen some of these issues. And especially because it's more than half the price of the S1H. And so if you just don't have the budget for the S1H, it's still a good camera to consider. So although both cameras don't have the same dynamic range, I still felt that when I was lighting this scene, I used my D&O LED lighting and I bounced it off of various places in the room to light this scene. A lot of times when I'm filming in this loft, the fluorescent light underneath my counter tends to blow out on most cameras, but with both of these cameras, with adding another light to the room, I could get the exposure pretty much there with that fluorescent tube. It was right at the edge of blowing out, or maybe it did blow out in a couple shots, but it held up pretty well on both cameras. Even with the fact that the Sigma FP has a much lower dynamic range, and you can really notice it in certain areas. But because it's a raw file and you can pull all that image back up in post, I just didn't have any problems with it. So if you want to see a little bit more footage from each one of these cameras, definitely check out my other videos I did on the Sigma FP and the Panasonic S1H on my YouTube channel. So let me know in the comments if you could tell a big difference between the image quality of each camera, or maybe give me a good reason why you'd pick one or the other, because I kind of want to know. I'm kind of in the market still looking for a new camera, and I can't really decide. So let me know in the comments what you think, and if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, and if you loved it, subscribe to the channel. There'll be more videos like this coming soon. And until next time, guys, I'm Spencer Sakurai. See ya.